The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and stale paper, a place where hope often came to plead and sometimes left in handcuffs. Grace Thompson stood alone at the defense table, her shoulders squared but trembling, fingers clenched around a worn leather purse. The judge leaned forward, robe heavy, voice sharper than the gavel he held. "So you expect this court to believe you?" he scoffed. A few muffled chuckles rippled through the room. Grace lowered her eyes, the weight of every stare pressing into her skin, every second stretching like a held breath just before breaking. "Before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now?" It still amazes me how one story can reach hearts across oceans and streets alike. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far empathy can travel tonight. Grace hadn't always been afraid of rooms like this. Once, she'd believed in systems, in rules written to protect people like her. But life had a way of sanding hope down to splinters. She was a single mother from the south side of Chicago, juggling 2 jobs, unpaid bills, and a son who grew up too fast because someone had to. That morning, she wore her best coat, thrifted, slightly too big, hoping it would make her look respectable enough to be heard. The charge was minor on paper. A misunderstanding, really. A confrontation at a grocery store where words escalated, security was called, and suddenly Grace was labeled disruptive. She tried to explain. She always tried. But explanations sound like excuses when no one's listening. The judge tapped his pen, eyes narrowing. "Ms. Thompson, your story keeps changing," he said, though it hadn't. "Perhaps you should think before speaking next time." Grace swallowed hard. Her attorney, overworked and silent, stared down at his notes. The prosecutor smirked, already certain of the ending. Behind her, the benches were filled with strangers, some bored, some curious, some quietly judgmental. Grace felt small, like the room was shrinking just to remind her of her place. Her mind drifted, uninvited, to her son, Ethan, 26 years old. Tall, calm, always watching more than he spoke. He'd insisted on dropping her off that morning, squeezing her hand before she stepped out of the car. "I'll be right here, Mom," he'd said softly. She hadn't asked him to come inside. Courtrooms were heavy places. She didn't want that weight on him. The judge sighed dramatically. "You people," he muttered, not quite under his breath. A clerk coughed. Grace flinched. The word people landed harder than any sentence ever could. It carried years with it, assumptions, dismissals, doors quietly closed. "Stand up straight when I address you," the judge snapped. Grace straightened, spine burning, eyes glassy but dry. She refused to cry. Not here. Not again. The gavel came down once, sharp and final sounding. "Given your attitude and lack of credible explanation, this court is inclined to..." "Excuse me." The voice cut through the air like a blade through silk. Controlled. Every head turned. Ethan stood near the back, one hand resting casually on the wooden bench, the other tucked into his jacket. He hadn't meant to interrupt, not yet, but something in the judge's tone tipped a line inside him that had been drawn years ago. The judge frowned. "This is a court of law. Sit down, sir." Ethan didn't move. "With respect, Your Honor, I believe you're mischaracterizing my mother." A murmur spread through the room. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. She twisted around, eyes wide. "No," she whispered, barely audible. The judge's face hardened. "And who exactly are you?" Ethan met his gaze without blinking. "I'm someone who's been listening very carefully." Silence fell, thick and uneasy. Grace felt a mix of fear and pride crash together inside her chest. She wanted to protect her son, even now. Always now. Memories flickered, late nights waiting for him to come home safe, early mornings packing lunches with notes she hoped he'd read. She'd raised him to be respectful, to keep his head down, to survive. This wasn't survival. This was something else. The judge leaned back, irritated. "You'll have your chance to speak if you're called," he said. "Until then, you will sit." Ethan hesitated, then slowly took his seat, but his eyes never left the front of the room. Grace turned forward again, hands shaking, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. The air felt charged, like a storm waiting for permission to break. The judge cleared his throat and resumed, voice colder now. As I was saying, but something had shifted. Not just in Grace. In the room itself. Whispers hummed beneath the silence. The prosecutor glanced back once, curious. The clerk's pen paused mid-scratch. Grace breathed in, steadying herself. Whatever was coming, she felt it deep in her bones. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the moment right before everything changed. And as the judge lifted his gavel again, unaware of just how much control he was about to lose, the courtroom held its breath. The judge adjusted his glasses, unaware that the smallest crack had already formed in his certainty. Order, he said, striking the gavel once more. We will proceed. Grace clasped her hands together, knuckles pale. Her pulse thudded in her ears so loudly she almost missed the clerk calling the next procedural step. The words blurred, codes, dates, formalities, but the tone remained the same. Distant, dismissive, final. She felt like an object being weighed, measured, and found lacking. Then something unexpected happened. The bailiff, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a badge dulled by years of service, leaned slightly toward Grace. His voice was barely more than a breath. Ma'am, take a deep breath. You're doing okay. It wasn't much. It wasn't loud. But it was kind. Grace inhaled shakily. That single sentence loosened the tight knot in her chest just enough for air to get through. She nodded, whispering, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure he heard her. Ethan did. From the back of the room, he noticed the way his mother's shoulders eased by a fraction. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but resolve. If you were standing there watching that moment unfold, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent to protect yourself? Be honest. Share your answer in the comments. And if you felt that small act of kindness in your chest, tap like to remind the world it still matters. The prosecutor resumed, painting Grace as volatile, unreliable. Words like aggressive and uncooperative floated freely, unchallenged. Grace opened her mouth once, then closed it. Experience had taught her that interruptions only made things worse. She stared at the seal behind the judge's head instead, tracing its edges to keep herself grounded. Ethan's mind drifted, not away, but backward. To nights when sirens sang him to sleep. To mornings when his mother worked double shifts, coming home with swollen feet and a smile she forced just for him. He remembered the promise he'd made at 16, standing beside her beat-up car after it failed inspection again. One day, I'll make sure no one ever talks to you like that. He hadn't known how then. He knew now. The judge leaned forward again. Ms. Thompson, do you have anything further to add before I make my ruling? Grace's lips parted. Her throat tightened. This was it. She felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the urge to cry, to beg, to explain her humanity in a room that treated it like an inconvenience. She shook her head slowly. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded, satisfied. Very well. Your Honor, Ethan said again, rising, this time without hesitation. A sharp intake of breath swept the room. Grace spun around. Ethan, please. The judge slammed the gavel. I warned you. One more interruption and I will have you removed. Ethan raised both hands, palms open. Understood. I'll be brief. The judge hesitated. Something in the young man's calm unsettled him. This better be good. Ethan took one step forward, his voice steady but respectful. You've questioned my mother's credibility. You've implied intent where there was confusion. And you've spoken to her in a way that suggests you already decided who she is before she opened her mouth. The room went dead silent. Grace felt heat rush to her face, fear and pride tangled together. She wanted to pull him back, shield him from consequences she knew too well. But Ethan stood firm. The judge's eyes narrowed. Careful. Ethan nodded once. I am. He reached into his jacket slowly. The bailiff stiffened, hand twitching near his belt. Ethan paused, meeting his gaze, then carefully removed a leather wallet. He didn't open it yet. I'm not here to disrupt the court, Ethan said. I'm here because the truth matters. And because the woman you're about to sentence raised me to believe that respect goes both ways. A murmur rolled through the benches. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The clerk looked up, pen hovering. Grace whispered, "Please?" Her voice cracked. She'd spent her life protecting him. The idea that he might suffer because of her pain was unbearable. Ethan turned, offering her a small smile. The kind he used to give her before school presentations, before big moments. "I've got this," it said. He faced the judge again. "Before you rule, I ask one thing. Allow me to identify myself properly." The judge exhaled, annoyed. "Proceed." Ethan opened the wallet, but didn't show it yet. "My name is Ethan Thompson," he said. "And I can assure you, my presence here isn't accidental." The tension in the room thickened, every breath measured. Grace felt the world tilt, like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. She didn't yet understand what her son was about to reveal, but she knew, with sudden certainty, that the power in the room was no longer one-sided. As Ethan took another step forward, the leather wallet still closed in his hand, the judge leaned back, unaware that the next few seconds would unravel everything he thought he knew. The judge studied Ethan with thinly veiled irritation, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You're delaying the inevitable," he said. "This court doesn't have time for theatrics." Ethan didn't flinch. He opened the wallet now, but still kept it angled toward his own chest, as if the moment itself needed care. "I understand the court's time is valuable," he replied. "That's why accuracy matters." Grace's heart hammered. Every second stretched. She searched her son's face, trying to read what he was thinking, what he was about to do. She realized then how little she truly knew about his life these past few years. He'd been private, purposeful, always saying he worked for the government whenever she asked too many questions. She never pushed. Mothers like her learned early not to ask questions that might bring danger home. The judge gestured impatiently. "Spit it out." Ethan finally lifted the wallet and turned it outward. A badge caught the overhead lights, gold, unmistakable. Beneath it, crisp lettering and a photo that matched the man standing there now. "I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Ethan said calmly. "Badge number available upon request." The room exploded into sound. Guess. Whispers. A chair scraping the floor. The prosecutor froze mid-breath. The clerk's pen clattered onto the desk. Even the bailiff straightened, eyes wide, posture snapping to attention without conscious thought. Grace's knees nearly buckled.
This court finds in favor
"FBI,"
of the plaintiff.
someone
Case
whispered,
closed.
not quietly enough. The judge leaned forward so fast his chair groaned. "That's..." He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "That's a serious claim." Ethan nodded. "Which is why I wouldn't make it lightly. I'm currently assigned to a joint task force focusing on civil rights violations and procedural misconduct." The words landed like thunder. Grace stared at the badge, her vision blurring. Memories flooded back. Ethan studying late into the night, unexplained absences, phone calls he took outside. The way he always listened, always noticed details others missed. She'd been so focused on surviving that she hadn't seen the man he was becoming. The judge's face drained of color. "Why," he said slowly, "are you here?"
Case closed.
Ethan didn't hesitate. "Because my mother was treated as a problem instead of a person. And because I've spent my career investigating what happens when authority forgets accountability." Silence returned, heavier than before. Have you ever had someone stand up for you when you felt completely alone? If yes, write "yes" in the comments and share their name. Sometimes gratitude deserves to be spoken aloud. Grace felt tears finally spill over. She covered her mouth, shaking. This wasn't just pride, it was relief. A lifetime of swallowing disrespect suddenly had a witness. A defender. Her son. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should..." "Yes,"
This
the
court
judge
finds in
snapped,
favor of the
then
plaintiff.
stopped
Case
himself.
closed.
His tone softened abruptly. "Yes, perhaps we should take a brief recess." Ethan shook his head. "That won't be necessary." The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not here to intimidate or interfere," Ethan said. "But since my credentials are now relevant, I'd like the record to reflect the language used toward the defendant today. Specifically, statements implying dishonesty without evidence." The clerk hesitated, then began typing. Grace watched the judge's authority crumble, piece by piece. The same man who had mocked her minutes ago now chose his words carefully, as if each one were being weighed on a scale he could no longer control. The judge adjusted his robe, voice measured. "Ms. Thompson, I may have spoken hastily." Grace said nothing. She didn't trust her voice. Ethan stepped closer to her side, not touching but present. A quiet show of solidarity. "My mother has no prior record," he continued. "Security footage corroborates her account. And the store has already issued an apology, which the prosecution failed to mention." The prosecutor stiffened. "That was not." "It was," Ethan replied evenly. "Filed yesterday." The judge rubbed his temples. The courtroom felt different now, less like a trap, more like a reckoning. Eyes that once judged Grace now watched the bench, waiting. Grace felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not victory. Not revenge. Dignity. As the judge prepared to speak again, the air tight with consequence, Grace realized this wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about what happens when truth walks into a room that assumed it wouldn't. And as Ethan stood beside her, badge still visible, the next words from the bench would decide far more than a single ruling. The judge cleared his throat, the sound sharper than before. "Given new information," he said carefully, "the court will revisit its position." Grace stood still, afraid that even breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile shift in the room. Her hands trembled at her sides, but Ethan's presence grounded her. He didn't touch her, didn't need to. Just standing there, steady and unflinching, felt like a shield. The prosecutor shuffled papers, suddenly invested in details he'd dismissed earlier. "Your Honor, while the defendant's son's credentials are notable," he said, choosing his words like stepping stones, "we must ensure this proceeding remains impartial." Ethan nodded. "I agree. That's all I've asked for." Impartial. The word echoed in Grace's mind. She wondered how many times it had been spoken in rooms like this while people like her were quietly crushed beneath its weight. The judge leaned forward, voice lower now. "Ms. Thompson, I'd like you to explain the incident again. Take your time." Grace blinked. That had never happened before. She drew a breath, deeper than any she'd taken all morning. "I was at the checkout," she began, voice soft but steady. "My card declined. I asked for a moment. The clerk sighed. The line got restless. I felt embarrassed. I asked to put an item back. Someone behind me said I was holding everyone up. I told them I was doing my best." Her fingers curled into her palm, grounding herself in the memory. Security came. I tried to explain. I never yelled. I never threatened anyone. I just didn't move fast enough. The judge listened. Actually listened. No tapping pen. No sighing. Ethan watched the room instead, how shoulders relaxed, how faces softened. He'd seen this before, in interviews and depositions. When someone finally felt safe enough to tell the truth, it changed the temperature of everything. "Thank you," the judge said quietly when Grace finished. A pause followed. Not awkward. Reflective. "Now it's your turn to pause for a second. Share one small good thing you did recently, something kind, something human. Write it below so others remember goodness still exists. Your moment might be exactly what someone else needs tonight." The judge glanced down at the file again, then back up. "The security footage," he said. "Play it." The screen flickered to life. Grainy, overhead footage showed Grace exactly as she described, standing, waiting, shrinking into herself as tension rose around her. No aggression. No disturbance. Just a woman caught in an unforgiving moment. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. The judge exhaled slowly. "It appears," he said, "that this case was brought without sufficient cause." Grace's knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the table. "I'm dismissing the charges," the judge continued. "Effective immediately." A ripple of sound moved through the courtroom. Relief, surprise, quiet approval. Grace covered her face, shoulders shaking as silent sobs broke free. Ethan turned fully toward her now, placing a hand on her back. "Solid. It's over," he whispered. But the judge wasn't finished. "Ms. Thompson," he said, standing. Grace looked up, wiping her eyes. "I owe you an apology." The word hung in the air, rare and heavy. My conduct earlier was inappropriate, the judge continued. This court exists to serve justice, not assumptions. I failed that today. Grace nodded slowly. She didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because the apology wasn't for words. It was for something deeper. Something long overdue. Ethan watched closely. Apologies from power were fragile things. They mattered, but only if followed by change. The judge turned his gaze to the room. Let this serve as a reminder, he said, that dignity is not conditional. The bailiff opened the side door. The clerk finalized paperwork with shaking hands. As Grace and Ethan stepped away from the table, something unexpected happened. A woman from the benches, middle-aged, neatly dressed, stood and began to clap. One clap became two. Then more. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was sincere. Grace paused, overwhelmed. She'd walked into the room invisible. She was leaving scene. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with low voices and echoing footsteps. Grace leaned against the wall, breath catching up with her body. I didn't know, she said finally, looking at her son, about any of it. Ethan smiled softly. I wanted you safe. That's all. She reached up, touching his cheek the way she used to when he was little. You were always watching out for me, she said. I just didn't realize how much. Ethan glanced back toward the courtroom doors, now closed. His expression shifted, pride giving way to something heavier, thoughtful. This wasn't just about saving his mother. He knew that. What happened inside that room was a spark, but sparks could either fade or start fires. And as they began walking down the hallway together, the weight of what still needed to be faced followed closely behind them, waiting for the moment when forgiveness and consequence would collide. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a hollow thud, muting the echo of the room they'd just left. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the concrete steps, bright enough to make Grace squint. She paused there, breathing in deeply, as if testing whether freedom felt different in the open air. It did. Cars passed. People talked. Life went on, indifferent, relentless. And yet, for Grace, something fundamental had shifted. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart slow for the first time in hours. I thought I was going to lose everything in there, she said quietly. Ethan stood beside her, scanning the street out of habit, then looked back at her. You weren't, he said. You just didn't know who was standing with you yet. They descended the steps together. Halfway down, a man in a suit, someone from the courtroom, caught up to them. Ms. Thompson, he said awkwardly. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up. Grace offered a small, tired smile. Thank you, she replied. She meant it. Apologies didn't erase pain, but they mattered. They always had. When the man walked away, Grace turned to her son. Is this what you do? She asked gently. Confront people like that? Ethan exhaled. Sometimes, he said. Mostly I listen. I document. I wait. And then, when it's time, I act. She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight behind his words. That judge, she said, glancing back at the building. You think he meant it? Ethan didn't answer right away. I think he meant it in that moment, he said finally. What matters is what he does next. They reached the car. Grace sat inside but didn't close the door. Her hands rested in her lap, still trembling slightly. All those years, she said, voice barely above a whisper. All the times I swallowed my words because I thought no one would listen. Ethan crouched down so he was eye level with her. I listened, he said, even when you thought I wasn't. Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears were different, lighter, warmer. I wanted to protect you, she said. I never wanted you to carry my battles. He smiled sadly. You taught me how. If that reveal just hit you right here, deep in the chest, leave a red heart. Sometimes one small symbol is the only way to say, I felt that too. They drove away in silence, the city sliding past the windows. Grace watched familiar streets with new eyes. The corner store. The bus stop. The school where Ethan used to wait for her after class. Ordinary places that had held quiet struggles she never spoke about. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "This is Internal Affairs. We'd like to follow up regarding today's proceeding." Grace looked at the screen, confused. "What's this?" Ethan glanced over, his jaw tightening. "It's starting," he said. "What's starting?" "The part where accountability doesn't end at an apology." They pulled into Grace's apartment complex, a modest brick building with chipped paint and uneven steps. She hesitated before getting out of the car. "Are you in trouble?" she asked suddenly. Ethan shook his head. "No. But some people might be." Inside her apartment, the air smelled faintly of laundry detergent and last night's dinner. Grace set her purse down carefully, like it might shatter if handled wrong. She sank into a chair, exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. Ethan leaned against the counter, phone already in his hand, reading messages she wasn't meant to see. His face had changed, not hard, but focused. The look of someone stepping back into a role that didn't allow softness for long. Grace studied him. This man she'd raised. This stranger she loved more than anything. "Ethan," she said quietly. He looked up. "Whatever happens next," she said, "promise me one thing." "Anything." "Don't let this make you cruel," she said. "I don't want justice if it costs you your heart." He crossed the room and knelt in front of her again, taking her hands. "It won't," he said firmly. "Because you didn't raise me that way." They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, the weight of the day settling around them. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, life, still messy and loud. Grace knew the worst had passed. But she also knew something else now. The pain she'd carried wasn't invisible anymore. And before the dust fully settled, there would be a question neither of them could avoid, whether forgiveness was possible, and what it would cost to offer it. The answer was coming. The knock came just after sunset. Grace stiffened in her chair, the soft glow of the living room lamp casting long shadows across the walls. She hadn't moved much since Ethan left an hour earlier. Called back to the office, he'd said, voice careful, "I'll be back tonight." She believed him. She always had. Another knock. Firmer this time. Grace rose slowly and opened the door. The judge stood there. No robe. No bench. Just a man in a dark coat, hair slightly disheveled, hands clasped together like he wasn't sure what to do with them. For a second, neither of them spoke. The hallway light flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," he said finally. His voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried earlier. "I asked for the address through proper channels." Grace stared at him, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something sharper. Memory. Humiliation. The sound of laughter in a courtroom that had swallowed her whole. "I came," the judge continued, "because apologizing from the bench wasn't enough." Grace stepped aside slowly. "You should come in," she said, surprising herself. He entered, glancing around the modest apartment, the framed photos on the wall. Ethan at graduation, Ethan in a borrowed suit, Ethan hugging her too tightly. The judge swallowed. "I was wrong," he said again, more quietly. "And not just today." Grace sat back down. She didn't invite him to sit. He didn't ask. "I've presided over thousands of cases," he continued. "I told myself I was efficient. But today," his voice cracked, just barely. "Today I saw myself through your son's eyes." Grace folded her hands together. "And what did you see?" "A man who forgot that power doesn't make you right," he said. "It just makes the damage larger when you're wrong." Silence filled the room. Grace closed her eyes. Images flooded back. Years of being talked down to, dismissed, silenced. Not just by judges. By managers. Doctors. Teachers. Strangers. She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze. "You humiliated me," she said softly. "In front of people who already believed I deserved it." The judge nodded. "I know. I went home thinking I'd failed as a mother," she continued. "That my son would see me as weak." The judge's shoulders sagged. "I'm sorry." The word felt different this time. Heavier. Riskier. Grace stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly. Not yet. He didn't argue. I wouldn't expect you to. She turned back to him. But I don't want to carry this anger forever either. He bowed his head slightly. Whatever accountability looks like, I'll accept it. Grace studied him for a long moment. She thought of Ethan's words. What matters is what he does next. Be honest with yourself for a moment. After something like that, could you forgive? Type forgive if you think you could, or never if it would cut too deep. The judge left shortly after, his steps slow, deliberate. Grace locked the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Later that night, Ethan returned. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting, face unreadable. When she finished, he sat beside her, elbows on his knees. You didn't owe him that, he said. I know, she replied. But I owed myself peace. He nodded slowly. Internal Affairs opened a formal review, he said. What happened today won't disappear. Grace reached for his hand. Just promise me something. Anything. When this is all over, she said, remember that justice isn't about winning. It's about healing what was broken. Ethan squeezed her hand. That's the only reason I do this. Outside, the city hummed on, imperfect, unresolved. But inside that small apartment, something had shifted again. Not closure. Not yet. But the fragile beginning of hope. And as night settled in, Grace felt it quietly, steadily. The weight she'd carried for so long was finally starting to lift. Morning light crept through the blinds, painting soft lines across the living room floor. Grace woke on the couch, stiff and slow, the events of the past day rushing back before her feet even touched the ground. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, the courtroom, the badge, the apology at her door. Then she heard Ethan's voice in the kitchen. Mom? Coffee's ready. She smiled faintly and sat up. The smell of fresh coffee wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Ethan stood by the counter, sleeves rolled up, looking more like the boy she'd raised than the man who had shaken a courtroom. They ate in quiet comfort. Not heavy silence, just the kind that comes after storms pass, when words feel unnecessary. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. Local judge under review following courtroom incident. Grace stared at the headline, heart thudding. She handed the phone to Ethan. He read it once, then set it down. It's moving fast, he said. Grace nodded. I didn't ask for that. I know, he replied. But sometimes light shows up whether we ask for it or not. They stepped outside later that morning. The neighborhood was alive. Kids laughing, buses groaning, neighbors nodding in passing. Life, unchanged, yet somehow different. A woman from the building across the street hurried over. Grace, she said breathlessly. I saw the clip online. That was your son. Grace laughed softly, overwhelmed. Yes, it was. The woman squeezed her arm. You should be proud. Grace looked at Ethan. He shifted uncomfortably, never liking attention. But his eyes softened when he met hers. I am, she said simply. That afternoon, Ethan received a call that pulled him away again. Another meeting, another statement. Grace watched him leave, pride and worry intertwined. She prayed quietly, not for protection, but for wisdom. Hours later, he returned. They're recommending mandatory training, public apology, and temporary suspension, he said. It's not perfect, but it's something. Grace considered this. Do you think it'll change anything? Ethan shrugged. Not everything. But maybe the next woman won't have to stand alone. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. That thought, that someone else might be spared, made the pain feel lighter. That evening, she sat on her balcony, watching the sun dip behind the buildings. Ethan joined her, handing her a folded blanket. If you believe love still wins, she said softly, almost to herself, after everything. She looked out at the city, then back at her son. Comment he in your heart. Because sometimes hope needs to be spoken to stay alive. Ethan smiled. You're getting poetic. She laughed. I've earned it. They sat together as darkness fell, the city lights flickering on one by one. Grace thought about how close she'd come to breaking, and how, instead, she'd been held. Not by systems. Not by power. But by people. And as the night deepened, she knew the story wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about what rises after. What stays. What heals. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the ordinary beauty of survival, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, imperfect, but real, settled gently into her bones. The city slept lightly that night, restless but alive. From her balcony, Grace watched headlights glide through the streets like slow-moving constellations. Somewhere below, a radio played softly. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Life kept stitching itself together in small, imperfect ways. Grace wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, her thoughts didn't race. They wandered, back through years of quiet endurance, forward into days she hadn't planned for but no longer feared. Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, hands in his pockets. "I keep thinking about something you said," he murmured. "About justice not being about winning." Grace nodded. "Winning ends things," she said. "Healing keeps them from happening again." He glanced at her, studying her face in the dim light. "You know," he said, "most people I interview are angry. Rightfully so. But they're also tired. I see that tiredness in their eyes." Grace smiled faintly. "That's because pain takes energy. Hope does too, but it gives some back." They fell quiet again. The night breeze carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Grace closed her eyes, remembering the courtroom. The laughter, the sharp words, the way she'd shrunk inside herself. Then she remembered something else, the bailiff's whisper. The woman who clapped. The apology that came not from power, but from humility. Pain didn't vanish, she realized. It softened. It learned where to sit without taking up the whole room. Her phone buzzed once more. A message from an unknown number, brief and careful. "Thank you for reminding me why this matters." Grace didn't ask who sent it. She didn't need to know. She typed back a single word. "Listen." Ethan watched her, curious. "Work?" he asked. "No," she said. "Life." The next morning, Grace returned to her routine. Grocery store. Bus stop. A brief chat with a neighbor she'd never really spoken to before. Nothing dramatic happened. And somehow that felt like a gift. At the checkout counter, her card hesitated again, just a second longer than expected. Grace felt the familiar flutter of anxiety rise, then settle. The clerk smiled patiently. "Take your time," the clerk said. Grace exhaled. "Thank you." Outside, she paused on the sidewalk, eyes stinging, not from fear, but from gratitude. Change didn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as decency. That evening, Ethan packed his bag. Another assignment. Another city. Grace hugged him tightly, holding on just a second longer than usual. "I'll call," he promised. "I know," she said. "And wherever you go, remember who you're doing this for." He smiled. "I always do." After he left, Grace sat alone at the small kitchen table, a cup of tea warming her hands. She thought about the countless stories like hers that never reached a courtroom camera, never had a badge step forward. Stories that ended differently. Her chest tightened, but not with despair. With resolve. If this story moved you, don't scroll past it quietly. Tap like, not for me, but for the woman who carried years of quiet pain and still chose dignity over bitterness. One simple click can be your way of saying, "I saw you. I felt you." Grace stood and turned off the lights, the apartment settling into darkness. She paused at the window one last time, looking out at the city she'd survived and still loved. The world hadn't suddenly become fair. But it had become possible. And sometimes, that's enough to begin again. Grace whispered a quiet promise into the night, not to the judge, not to the system, but to herself. "I will not disappear." Then she closed the curtain, carried that promise with her into the quiet, and let hope, gentle, earned, and human, stay.